Welcome to Big Ideas Made Simple. I'm Jess Weber, speaker, entrepreneur, and someone who has spent years confidently introducing myself as a version of a person who had been almost entirely written by others. And I honestly didn't notice for a very long time. So today, that's what I want to get into in this episode. And if you're new here, every episode I take one big idea, strip it down to what actually matters, and hand you something you can use before we're done. So no fluff, no filler, just a thing. So let's get going. Now, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it before you keep listening. Take a moment to actually really consider your answer for this. When someone asks you, what do? What is the first thing that comes out of your mouth? Is it a role, a title, the name of a company or an organization you're affiliated with, or a former position that you still use as a credibility anchor? Is it something you built inside of somebody else's organization or infrastructure? Something that only makes sense in a specific industry context? Something that requires the listener to already know certain names for the answer to land the way that you really want it to? Most people, if they're honest, lead with borrowed authority. Not because they're dishonest, but because they were taught that context creates credibility. And in a lot of professional environments, that's true. You are from that firm, or you trained under that person. You held that role inside an organization. And inside those containers, those things do matter until they don't. And here is what is happening everywhere right now. Everyone is talking about personal brand, whether it's a LinkedIn coach, a podcast guest, a keynote speaker, a course, a 3-day challenge. I don't care where it is. You will see people promising that you need to find your voice and claim your space and build your presence and therefore build your brand. And the advice, especially from influencers, is almost always the same. It's time on task over time. It's consistently showing up in your niche and telling your story and creating that content and being authentic. And the reason so many people, I believe, are struggling with this is not because it's the tactics. The tactics are fine. The reason people struggle is that they are trying to build a brand on top of an identity that they haven't fully examined yet. They are putting a new, beautiful front door on a house they've never even walked in. It's not a branding problem. It's an identity problem. We are seeing a cultural identity crisis. And that always traces back to the same thing. Someone told you who you were, and you believed them, so much so that you have been performing that version ever since. And sometimes you're so fluent in that performance that you stop being able to tell where the performance ends and where you actually begin. That is the thing that I really want to talk about who wrote your default identity and whether any of it is still true for you, and then what that actually means to own who you are rather than just brand it. So my reframe is this, and it comes from a book that I want to be clear about upfront because the title sounds more aggressive than the way that I'm thinking about it. Patrick Bet-David wrote a book called Choose Your Enemies Wisely. And his premise is this: there's a difference between a competitor and an enemy. And you know who your competitors are in your space. You can talk about them calmly, list their strengths, track their moves, but enemies are different. When you think about an enemy, it evokes some level of emotion. So you feel something, and it often creates a sense of feeling like nothing can stop you when you're up against them. So his whole premise focuses on the difference between acting out of logic first, or acting out of emotion first. And so here's what I want to use in and of that today, because I don't want this episode to be all about labeling villains or dwelling on people who wronged you or settling scores. That's not what it is. But I want to take from Bet David a deeper insight that is kind of underneath his main premise. And here's where I sit with that. The most powerful enemies are not people. They are experiences, they're moments. They are the voices and the systems and the containers that told you who you were, what you were worth, and which version of yourself was acceptable in the room. Your enemy might be a role that you outgrew and you still showed up in how you introduce yourself with it. Or it might be an organization that shaped your entire professional identity before you knew enough to know how to shape it for yourself. It might even be a version of success that was handed to you before you had a chance to decide what you actually wanted for yourself. Choosing your enemy wisely is not about finding someone to fight with. It is about getting honest about what shaped you. Like, where did your default self come from? Because that thing, that experience or system, container, partnership, whatever, has more to do with how you show up today than most people want to admit. And the move is not about being angry with it. The move is to use it, to look at it clearly and decide what is still true and what is not. And let the clarity become the fuel that pushes you towards who you actually are becoming rather than the anchor that holds you to who you were told to be. So here's the other thing I want to name before we get into a story. There is always a difference to me regarding identity and personal brand. And I think that the noise around personal brand conflates with the two in a way that makes both of them harder. So, identity is who you actually are. It's your core personal values, your patterns, the things that you keep being called back to regardless of context. It's the DNA that is present in every role or room or season of your life. Personal brand, for me, is how you communicate that identity in the world. It's the language or the positioning or the stories that you're telling about yourself in a way that other people can receive it and recognize it. And I think the reason so many struggle with personal brand advice is that it skips straight to the communication layer and never deals with the foundation that's underneath it. You can't build a brand that actually lands until your own identity is supposed to represent. And you can't own an identity you have never examined. You are just dressing up someone else's story in your own clothes and wondering, why doesn't this fit? And that is because someone somewhere told you who you were. The question is whether you have ever stopped and paused long enough to decide if you even agree with them. So I want to tell you something about why I'm recording this episode, and if you're watching on YouTube, why I don't look quite as put together as I often do in other episodes. I literally just rolled in from 3 days in Searcy, Arkansas. And if you were there, you'll understand why that's funny to me, because the incredible MC kept saying Searcy, and the entire audience full of predominantly local Arkansans, I think it is, would correct him every single time and say it's Searcy. Anyways, side note, I just got back from the Scale with Stability Summit, which was hosted by Karen and JC Hite. And I sat there in this room full of people who were building big, real businesses, teams. They had revenue, impact, but a lot of them were wrestling openly with the question that I asked you at the beginning of this episode. Who am I underneath all of this? Now, a lot of them could name who they were in the context of their belief system. And I do think that that is a point to note here because that was a faith-based conference. But there is so much more to us than just one thing. And so I think it's so incredibly important to sit here and think about, who am I in a greater context in all of this? And what have I been performing versus what is actually mine? So JC shared something during one of his sessions from the stage that I've been thinking about ever since. He was talking about a season of his life where everything looked really good from the outside. Everything was working. There was growth, team, momentum, all the good stuff. But he was struggling, panic attacks, depression, a breakdown, all of that. And so the success and his suffering were simultaneously running. And most people couldn't tell that at all because his external container looked fine. And I don't share that as a failure story. It's, to me, the first thought is the frog in the boiling water. And the temperature has been rising for years, right? And he didn't know how to recognize how hot it had gotten. So his wife, Karen, said something that I wrote down during her session. And she said the easiest way to burn out is trying to fulfill somebody else's purpose. Sit with that for a second. The easiest way to burn out is trying to fulfill somebody else's purpose. That's the whole episode in a sentence. It's the thing that you were carrying that wasn't even yours to carry in the first place, but you picked it up somewhere along the way because you felt like it belonged in your world, or the container that you were in told you that it was yours. They delegated your identity to you. And when I keep coming back and thinking about it, I mean, that's truly how conditioning works in the space of identity. It is the frog in the boiling pot of water. The idea that if you put a frog directly in the boiling pot, it jumps out immediately because it knows the water's hot. But if you put it in cool and slowly raise the temperature, the water will rise slowly the heat in the water will rise slowly and the frog won't notice and it'll stay in the water, never registering that the water has gotten to an unsafe temperature. I It's just funny how emotionally accurate this is because it describes exactly what is happening in today's world when I see people's identity shaped by the space that they're coming from, that role, that container, that culture, that organization. When you're in something, whether it's for months or years, you don't notice the temperature rising. You're just hanging out in the water. And it feels normal because it's what you know. The version of yourself that you have been performing in professional rooms might have been built so gradually through so many small adjustments and compressions and accommodations that you genuinely cannot see it from the inside. You borrowed authority through proximity to certain names, and you led with titles that gave you context before you had anything to say substantially. You shaped your introduction around what was legible in a specific industry culture. And it felt like strategic positioning. It probably was smart for that season. But the problem is not that the water was the wrong temperature. The problem is that you forgot you were the frog. Here's what changes when you get out. Not because somebody picks you up out of the pot and forces you out, but when you choose to step into a different environment and see what that contrast reveals for you. So you walk into a new room and you feel that gap. Your intro that you have always given, that is so internally ingrained in you, suddenly feels uncomfortable. It's not wrong. It just doesn't feel right. Like you're describing someone you used to be to somebody who doesn't know anything about you, and you realize that there is not all of the information about who you presently and currently are and what really might actually matter to them in that introduction. So that recognition or that gap is information. It's the difference in the temperature of that water. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. You start to notice which parts of your professional identity were yours and which parts were the containers, which things you would choose to carry if you could start over with a blank page, and the things that you've held on to for so long because you never had a reason to put them down. This whole concept, right, is not a quick process. I have to be honest, I've been working on this concept for myself personally, probably for the last year. And it's been a slow recognition of, oh my gosh, I was the frog for years prior to that. So it's not an episode where I give you a quick framework and you have a new identity by Friday. It's slow work. It happens through repeated exposure in different rooms or contexts with different people who know different versions of you. It becomes an opportunity to notice what feels true versus where you feel like you might be wearing a costume. And it happens through the kind of honest conversations that I talked about a couple episodes ago, episode 10. Except now, the thing you are testing isn't an idea anymore. It's you. So, what Patrick Bet David was pointing at is that clarity is about who wrote your default identity and how it's actually useful to you. Because again, it's not a grievance, it's fuel for the fire. And when you can recognize and name what shaped you, and you can review where conditioning shows up, you can decide deliberately what you really want to carry forward and what you want to leave behind. So it helps you stop fighting against a story that you never fully agreed to and start writing the one that you actually want. The frog that gets out of the water doesn't spend the rest of its life being angry about the pot. It just gets a lot better at gauging temperature. So it's faster or clearer or more instinctive because it knows what it feels like to be in the wrong water now. And that knowledge isn't a wound, it's its compass. So here's what this looks like for me in my own life, because I think the pattern is always clearer when you can see it specifically versus this big abstract idea. For years, I was introducing myself in professional rooms with a very specific structure. I would lead with my roles, my designations, my credentials, and then I would immediately typically leverage my notability in terms of my proximity to somebody else. So it would be a partnership. It would be the ownership group of an organization. It was people whose names carried weight in the organization that I was in. And, at one point, one of the owners of one of the organizations was the president of an entire international company, which meant that my introduction, without even having to say much, carried a weight that had nothing to do with me specifically. But it allowed me to gain authority through proximity. And I was genuinely good at what I did, but the confidence in those introductions was not coming from me. A significant part of it was borrowed, and I did not fully understand how much until I didn't have to borrow it anymore. When I left that role, I still had ownership and partnership inside the organization, and I was still connected. I still show up to those same industry events in the same rooms and the same conversations, but something shifted because I wasn't in the role anymore. I was not the director of this or the coordinator of that. I was me, myself, and I. I was Jess Weber, double S, double B, because I'm full of BS, right? And that's my new favorite line because it helps people remember how to actually spell my name. But anyways, it was the first time when I could show up and say that and not, hi, I'm Jess Weber, blah, 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 connected to blah, 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 doing this for blah, 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 that I really felt the gap. I could use the word former. And if I need to, I could say former director, team member, employee, partner, whatever. I used it for a while because the former is still borrowed authority if I need it, but it's past tense borrowed authority, and it's still where the container is giving me credibility on loan. And what I noticed over time was that I wanted to distance myself from it, not because I was ashamed of the season or the work that I'd done inside it, but because leading with the former felt like asking somebody to evaluate a version of me that wasn't the current present one. It didn't even exist anymore. I was asking for them to give me credit on something I wasn't even doing in a context that wasn't mine. So it's where the frog metaphor started to become personal. I didn't realize how much of my professional identity had been shaped by the container until I was no longer inside it. The water had been getting warmer for years. The gradual compression of who I was into what was useful in that specific culture or space. So it was the way that I had learned to make myself legible in that world. It was through language or frameworks or credibility markers. And it felt like mine because I did it for so long. But getting out of the water didn't feel like liberation at first. It was incredibly disorienting because some of what I thought my identity was turned out to be an adaptation. And figuring out the difference between those two things has been some of the most important work I've done in recent years. What changed for me was not that I have a new or better container, it's that I can gauge the temperature now in a way that I couldn't before. So I walked into rooms and I knew within a few exchanges whether it was an environment that wanted the full version of me or a compressed version. And I know when a room is asking me to borrow authority and when I am standing on something that's actually mine. I know when I am performing and when I am just being. And that knowing is the thing that David was pointing out when he was talking about choosing enemies wisely. When you know what shaped you, when you look at it clearly and recognize that the water you were swimming in is not the water that you want to stay in, you don't fight your past, you're using it. You're leveraging it to become clear and make future decisions and rooms easier to navigate. I still mention the years inside the organization sometimes because it is part of my story, but it's now a throwaway line. It's context rather than the credibility. It's a nod to where I came from, not who I am. And the distance between those two things is the distance between borrowed identity and owned one. So I would be remiss if I didn't leave you with something for the week, right? And here's the quick exercise in two parts. Please do not skip the second part. It's where information actually lives. So, step one, write down how you currently introduce yourself. Not the version you've rehearsed into a perfect elevator pitch, but the version that you actually give in the real rooms to real people when someone says, "Hey, Jess, what do you do?" Write it down as close to verbatim as you can. And then go through and highlight or circle every label that is a borrowed element. Every title, every former, every affiliated with, every I worked inside of it or I built it or I trained under it, every credential that is doing work on your behalf or piece of content that only makes sense to somebody who has context to that industry or organization or ecosystem. You are not judging it. You are just sitting down and looking at it. You are looking at the gap between what you said and what is actually yours. Part two, write down how you would introduce yourself if none of those borrowed elements were available. So, no former, no affiliates, no titles that require context, no other names bigger than yours doing the lifting for you. Just you in plain language, describe what you actually do, why it matters, and who you are becoming. That second step is probably really hard to write. It might feel thinner or less impressive or less weighty. And that discomfort for you is information because what you are feeling is the gap between identity and one that you've been performing versus one that you own. That gap's where your opportunity lives. Before we close, I want you to really understand. I don't expect this to be a 5-minute exercise. I'm not giving you some worksheet and telling you to turn it in as homework later. Building an identity that's yours is slow work. And it happens through exposure in different spaces, not in a silo. It happens through noticing what fits and what feels like you're putting on a costume for one of those spaces. And it really happens through gradual reprogramming that comes from letting the real version of you make contact with the world, conversation by conversation. Like I said, not in a silo, but room by room. So I'll challenge you. What you're building today is probably not actually a personal brand. You are building something underneath the brand. You're building the foundation for the brand that makes the language and the positioning actually mean something. Identity is not what you're posting. It's not your bio on LinkedIn. It is what is true about you in every context or room or season. And it's the thing that remains when you strip away all of the other containers. They're not mistakes. Those containers gave you real experience and skills and proximity to things you needed to grow as a person, but they were never meant to be permanent. And they're not technically meant to be the definition of you. So, someone somewhere told you who you were. And I want to challenge you and tell you that it is time to deliberately decide on your own terms what that answer is for you now. Your identity is not the label from the container. It never was. It was the thing that you were growing inside of it the whole time. So that's it for today's episode of Big Ideas Made Simple. If this one cracked open something, come find me over at bigideasmadesimple.com. It is where my newsletter lives, where things I'm building are taking shape, and where you can connect with me directly. I only send one idea to your inbox every week, nothing else. But I'll ask, if you know someone who is deep in the work of figuring out who they are on the outside of their container they've been stuck in, send them this episode. Because remember, the right idea at the right time changes everything. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.